You're listening to Scholé Sisters, episode number 76. Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, blogging my thoughts on Charlotte Mason and homeschooling and hawking a bunch of good things in the shop. My co-hosts today are Mystie Winkler and Abby Wall. Mystie is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé Sisters sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Registration is now open for this year's online local retreats, which will take place live on Saturday, October 10th. The theme of this year's retreat is Loving Well, and our guest speaker is the one and only Karen Glass. This is going to be a wonderful time in which we deeply explore the topic of love as it relates to homeschooling, mothering, continuing our own educations, and more. Go to scholesisters.com/love to register. Is there really such a thing as classical education for preschoolers? You may be surprised to learn that yes, the ancients actually had opinions on what to do with the little ones entrusted to our care. Today's episode discusses a bit about what Plato, Aristotle, and Quintilian had to say on this subject. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Who would like to go first?
I will go first. This is
all right.
I am taking the Liberty of Logic course, and It has been wonderful. And alongside that, I am pre-reading some books for my oldest student. And so one is The Philosophy of Tolkien and by Peter Kreeft, I think is how you say it. And Mathematics is God Silent by, I think it's Nichols is the last name of the author. But they are talking all about the same things in different ways. So I'm actually understanding my Liberty of Logic class. And it's very, it's great. So epistemology, cosmology, metaphysics, the 4 causes, all these things just keep coming up. And I've just been loving it. So, and I know, Brandy, you've read The Philosophy of Tolkien because I think you recommended it.
I loved it.
Yeah, it's so good. And the Mathematics is God Silent. It's part biography because he talks about these different mathematicians throughout the ages, and he talks about, their contributions, but he also talks about how God is in math and it isn't a secular subject, and the fact that it's become that. It's kind of an apologetics towards math as being this whole thing. And it's really good.
I have heard that he is now writing a math curriculum and that part of it's out.
Oh, okay.
And I thought about looking at it. I was debating over whether or not you could turn math into something that was too preachy. You know what I mean? Like I wasn't sure the angle it was going to take, but I'll be curious to hear more once you finish the whole book. And
I mean, and I've always assigned him math, like literature. I don't know how we would say it, but just like a math classic alongside a math curriculum, because
that's so great.
It goes to that idea of the mathematician's lament, right? That you are just doing computation rather than the music. You're never here. You're just reading notes and learning music theory, but never hearing the music. And so there've been just some great, I guess we call them living books on math that I have given my students or we've read, and they just develop, the holistic view of math.
Nice. I've done a tiny bit of that, but really it was Ravi at Christmas time who convinced me that I needed to do more of that. So this year for my older student who struggles with math, I've assigned Paul Lockhart's arithmetic book.
Yes. And for younger students, I love Mathematicians Are People Too. And it's just little stories.
I was looking at
my other favorite is String, Straight Edge, and Shadow. Ooh. And it's all about geometry and how they figured things out. And it's wonderful. And it's got great illustrations. It's a fabulous book.
Cool. Well, Mystie, you'd like to go next?
Okay, I can go next. I am currently reading with a local book club, two different local book clubs, the Liberal Arts Tradition with one and In Vital Harmony with another. And
I have to ask, are these all on Zoom or are you able to meet in person?
Our state's shutdown happened after we did our very first meeting for the In Vital Harmony group, which is a CM book club, which has been going for about a year and a half now. So this was our next book club pick.
Yeah.
After doing the excellent study through Charlotte Mason's 20 principles called Start Here.
Who wrote that?
Nice
Sounds
plug.
Brilliant.
And so then we have been meeting on Zoom, but now we're meeting in person outside when we can. But I mean, it's totally illegal. So
yeah, everything is now. It made criminals of all of us. Oh, except for the actual criminals, my governor's letting those up. So
the liberal arts tradition was partly my excuse. I knew different people in some different groups locally that were all interested in classical, and I wanted to bring them together.
Ooh.
But it just didn't really happen because of COVID.
Yeah.
So there are some people who don't know each other, but it's not the same kind of get to know you. And we have been meeting on Zoom because people just have different, we're in kind of totally different circles. So
yeah,
it's actually just easier for us to all be in our own space, meet up.
I'm doing a liberal arts tradition group, and because it's on Zoom, we're just meeting every week and we're reading, like 10 to 15 pages a week and discussing, which has been good. I mean, I was trying to get through it over summer, but it turns out the new edition of that book is too long to get through in summer, even doing that. Because there's so much to talk about. So we'll see how it goes as the school year kicks in and we're still meeting. I don't know if I can maintain every single week, but we're going to try. It's so good though. I can't believe how much more I like the new edition.
So good. And the discussions from it have been so good in our group.
My only complaint is I feel a lot less qualified.
Yeah, that's true.
All these mathematical proofs. I'm like, I guess a little humility is good for me. So we'll just take it.
So when this episode airs, the Scholé Sisters mentorship book club for Sophies through the liberal arts tradition is going to be underway, but it will not be too late to jump in. We're going to take 2 weeks through every section. So there's like a section on the liberal or the trivium and a section on the quadrivium and a section on natural philosophy. So that's how I've broken it up. It's the different sections. So some are longer than others, but it's kind of one topic. And we're going to take 2 weeks through every topic, 1 week to read and discuss. And then the second week to meet up on Zoom and have a book club group meeting for those who can. And those recordings will go into the bonus area. And to, maybe read something related that helps us understand that section better.
Nice.
Or work through kind of a thinking exercise, like a Scholé sheet that I'll have prepared for thinking through these ideas more deeply and talking about application. So read, think, apply.
Woohoo!
So I'm excited. I'm really excited for that.
It's going to be great.
And it's not too late to jump in, but it's for Sophies and it's in the bonus section of Sistership.
Yay! Well, I honestly haven't been reading that much because, by the time this goes live, we'll have dropped my oldest off at college, but we're getting ready to do that. And there's just a lot more to it than I expected. Plus, I still haven't planned high school. So anyway, it's okay. I'm not crying yet. I might next time we record. Anyway, so I haven't done much reading, but I did read my husband's book. So I'm so excited about this. And I was like, can I plug my husband's book on the show? It's okay, right?
It's okay.
Yay.
It's okay. It's good.
It's actually really good. I'm very excited. Doesn't that sound like I have so much faith in my husband? Well, he's in my defense. He hasn't written fiction before. This is not his first book, but he hasn't written fiction before. And so I just didn't realize what he had in him. So it's very exciting. But this was so Schoolay because I actually read most of it at the beach in the sun. It was so nice. And that's the only time we've left town really this summer, just because of all the shutdown stuff. And I shouldn't say that. There was one other time. But anyway, like the uncertainty of, well, if we get there, will bathrooms be open? And will we have to wear masks? Because I just refused to wear one, especially on the beach. And so anyway, it was so nice to be there and kind of read something that didn't require so much of my brain. It was just enjoyable. It was wonderful. So anyway, his book is called The Pension Plan, and it's a murder mystery. And we'll link it in the show notes if anyone wants to check it out. But
by the way, it's in my Amazon cart.
Is it really?
I'm just waiting till I get $25, dollars. I got rid of Amazon Prime. So because it wasn't being Prime. I had no 2-day shipping since COVID hit. So I was like, why am I paying for this?
So now shopping on Amazon is an exercise in patience.
Yeah. And I really need to stop giving my Amazon overlord more money. So,
I know.
But I am going to buy his book. So
yay! I had to thank him because I was like, thank you for making something that, I mean, it's written for adults, but like where I don't shudder, like it wasn't gory or anything, even though it's a murder mystery. And I was like, I just wanted to actually like be able to hand it to my teenage kids without being like, your dad wrote this book that's really not appropriate for you. So I was just so relieved. So anyway, the book will give you a special insight into politics in California too, I think, a little bit. Anyway, on to our topical discussion. So today's topic is, well, it's taken from the Great Tradition. So if any of you want to read along, we will try to give you page numbers and such. Mystie gave us some reading assignments from the Great Tradition, which is a big book edited by Richard Gamble, and it's full of primary sources. But what's nice about it is that if an author wrote something that's about all sorts of things, he cut down to the part that's really just about education. So when you read it, you're just getting the pertinent education part and not everything that they waxed eloquent about, which can be really, I mean, it can be really interesting to read a whole work and see all the ideas. But when you're trying to really get a handle on classical education, it's helpful that he cut it all down. So we're basically looking at some things Plato said.
And he translated these?
I think so.
Because it's really well written. Like it's very approachable.
It really is.
It is not, it's really nice to read. So
it doesn't call him the translator.
Yeah, he just is the editor.
These seem like modern translations, and it doesn't say who did it. So I don't know. I don't know if he did it, or I'm not sure. Strange for them to not say who did the translation.
Well, and all of them sound like the same voice.
That is true.
Yeah.
Like it sounds very cohesive. Even though you're reading about different people, it just sounds very much.
Yeah. I tried investigating this at one point, but if you look, so sources and permissions.
Oh.
That says what he used.
Okay.
Is that in the book somewhere?
In the back.
Yeah, it's in the back.
In the very back. Okay.
Sources and permissions. So
that would make sense, though, that I think a lot of the ones he's using are actually older translations.
But I think he might have still edited some of them.
Yeah.
So,
I think
for clarity's sake, because it says a translator and then says edited.
Nice. Well, he did a really good job. I really appreciate his work here.
Very readable.
We are looking today mainly at Plato, or only at Plato, Aristotle, and Quintilian. Not all of the things in there, but those are the three people that we're really looking to. So this is actually a big topic. So we're going to whittle it down and focus on aspects of tradition and taste, and also the starting age of a classical education. So what ages are, quote, preschool, according to the tradition?
Before school.
Yeah. In fact, let's start with that, because we should establish that before we go on, because that's really the context for the whole discussion. So someone want to explain where we're getting the idea of the age?
Let's see. I'm trying to see if I marked where that was, because Plato and Aristotle both gave an age for studies beginning.
So did Quintilian, I thought.
Yeah, Quintilian does too, but I think we're going to spend most of the time with Quintilian because he's much more developed in preschool, what to do with those ages. But Plato and Aristotle both did give a time frame for when they have studies that should be done by early students, but they clarify that they mean older. I think, was it Plato who was 7 and Aristotle who was 10?
I think Aristotle was 10.
Yeah, I think you're right on Plato being 7.
And I missed it in Plato. I somehow didn't. I was probably paying attention to something else at the time because I didn't remember that.
Yeah, so Aristotle says that they should begin studies of languages at 10 and it should continue for 3 years. And then basically, if they don't have it in 3 years, like give up on them. Let's see. A fair time for a boy of 10 years old to spend in letters is 3 years. The age of 13 is the proper time for him to begin the handle of the lyre, and he may continue with this for another 3 years, neither more nor less. Whether his father or himself like or dislike the study, he is not allowed to spend more or less time in learning music than the law allows.
Oh my goodness.
If the spot for governor opens up, I think he would be qualified to run California since he's going to get that involved in your personal life.
Oh, wait a sec. That's Plato. I'm sorry. That's not Aristotle. Yeah.
That makes sense though, because is that from the Republic?
It is where he also says that it's the state's education is the state's job,
Yeah,
and pupils don't belong to their.
No, it's it just says from the laws, but I don't know.
Oh yeah, the laws is kind of heavy-handed too. Plato makes me uncomfortable because of his communism.
They ought to be occupied with their letters until they are able to read and write. If nature has not stimulated them to acquire these accomplishments in the given number of years, they should be let alone.
I have some students that would take him up on that.
Yeah.
So they're not allowed to read him yet. Oh, wow. So we have 10, but that is for language study. Don't they actually mean foreign language? Isn't that the part where they talk? Wait, no, if it's Plato, they don't mean foreign language.
So Plato says at 10, they begin learning to read and write. They're not doing any reading or writing before that. They're doing exercises, and they aren't unoccupied, but
interesting.
They also aren't learning to read or write until 10.
So then Quintilian, can I quote Quintilian now? Mm-hmm. On page 110, he says, some hold that boys should not be taught to read until they are 7 years old, that beginning the earliest age at which they can derive profit from instruction and endure the strain of learning. But then he goes on and kind of argues that you could do some things in that area earlier. But it seems to me that we could say that even to him, it's pre-age 7, that would be what we would call preschool, like the preschool years.
Right. So this section where he talks about not doing anything until they're 7, it sounds like that's the normal age to begin studies. The question that's under discussion here is, what do you do before age 7? Do you do anything or nothing? Yeah. And that's, a question.
It's a perennial question.
It is.
Well, especially because to us, I don't know if it would have been that way to them, though it does sound like maybe there's a temptation. Like to us, if you do something, then it's that you bring whatever you would do in school down and start doing it earlier.
Right.
I'm going to start doing academics, which is so funny because, when I was a kid, preschool really was preschool. It was like play and finger painting. And it was like a place that you went to make all the messes your mom didn't want you making in the house. Really. That really was. It was like you had these wonderful, I remember my preschool teacher. I was driving my mom crazy. And so she put me in preschool. And this wonderful, patient woman let me do all the stuff my mom didn't want me to do. So anyway.
Well, I do think Quintilian starts this section in great tradition. It's 108. He says, I would therefore have a father conceive the highest hopes of his son from the moment of his birth. If he does so, he will be more careful about the groundwork of his education. And I think that's the heart that parents bring to the preschool conversation. And I love that Quintilian recognizes that and encourages that, because it often seems like the preschool conversations, go into two extreme camps, which is either we're doing school, with 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, or we're doing absolutely nothing with them.
Yep.
And so I think this section, page 108 through 111 in Quintilian, shows the moderate way, a reasonable, wise way that does make good use of the time while keeping it a distinct time.
What's interesting about this to me is that really what he's doing is addressing final cause, right? He's saying you have your purpose in mind, which comes back to things that we've talked about for years, right, guys? I mean, this idea that you don't just start doing things, you consider what your ultimate goals are. This idea of conceiving the highest hopes. It's so what we've been learning in Liberty of Logic, right? Things like goodwill towards your student and final cause. I just love that.
Yeah. Well, and I loved down a little bit further in, there's a couple things on Quintilian on page 109. Above all, see that a child's nurse speaks correctly. The ideal, according to Chrysippus. I don't know.
How'd you say that earlier, Misty? I liked how you said it.
Yeah. How did you say it, Misty?
Did I say it? Chrysippus?
Chrysippus. Okay, there
you go.
Would be that she should be a philosopher, except they're only talking about educating their sons. So how is it that a nurse is supposed to be a philosopher? So I was just laughing at that in this, but
okay, hold on. In his defense, further down on 109, he's further down, like one paragraph below that. He says, as regard parents, I should like to see them as highly educated as possible, and I do not restrict this remark to fathers alone.
So I think he's talking about sons because he's talking about an orator.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I did know that. And he did mention some women and their moms and like the thing. So I do get that, but I was just laughing a little bit because,
totally.
I didn't think that there were many women philosophers in this time. So,
right. Well, and that's the thing that's always made me laugh about, can I say this? I'm going to say this, but I might get in trouble. We might get hate mail over this comment, but like 10 years ago, there was this super conservative movement that was like, homeschool girls don't go to college.
Yeah.
Period. Yeah. Full stop. And I remember thinking about the irony. We want our boys so highly educated and we want them homeschooled. So we're going to put them in the care of a mother that we deliberately don't train.
Yeah.
Which I don't think that college is the only way to get training by any means. But it seemed to be this, we want to keep our girls at home and ignorant. Which was just kind of an interesting thing when you think about the idea that they're going to be the next generation of homeschoolers. So anyway.
And then it goes on to say a little bit later is, I would urge that they should have a thorough education, or if they have not, that they should be aware of that fact.
Yeah, I
know. And I loved that. There are no worse than those who, as soon as they have progressed beyond the knowledge of the alphabet, delude themselves into the belief that they are the possessors of real knowledge.
So true.
I just loved that. I was like, yes, just because you've watched Sesame Street does not mean that you are ready to, read a book. I'm probably less ready now. I don't even know what Sesame Street's doing these days.
Yes.
I always think about that kind of a thing when I look at textbooks from the public school down the street, and it's all bullet points and mainly call out boxes and stuff. And I'm like, wow, you could graduate with a whole bunch of talking points and very little real knowledge because there's no reasoning, at least in the ones that I've seen. there is no line of reasoning. So I'm not even talking about whether I agree or disagree with the conclusion. It's that conclusions are stated without reasoning.
Yep.
And so there's no practice in actual thinking, which means that's a really underdeveloped intellect that thinks it knows while having very little experience in real thought.
I heard a quote, or I read it somewhere, and I can't remember where it's from now, but it's like, the only thing about being spoon-fed is you get really well acquainted with just the spoon.
Oh, interesting.
So it's just that idea, like, if you're just being spoon-fed, then none of the substance that you're actually ingesting or taking in is doing anything, but you just become really dependent upon that spoon.
So can I just point out a little Charlotte Mason connection here before we move on?
They're abounding. Yeah.
They really are. I mean, I actually wondered if she read Quintilian and that's where she got her very firm opinions on choosing a suitable nurse.
Mm-hmm.
Because she really covers that thoroughly and talks about, she doesn't say the nurse should be a philosopher, but that's basically the conclusion of what she's saying.
But she does say that a parent should be, or the teacher should be, the philosopher, guide, and friend, right?
Yeah. Well, and not just that, specifically with the nurse, she talked about how dangerous a nurse's bad theology could be.
Yeah.
And like a nurse at one point she talks about a nurse, threatening that if the child disobeys, God's going to send the child to the bad place, meaning hell, like just really spiritually manipulating the child. I'm trying to remember exactly where this is, because there's a couple places where he mentions nurses, but it was just so many echoes of Charlotte Mason. The person you hire to caretake for your children is the curriculum in the early years.
Ooh.
And I wonder about how many people, because there are plenty of people who, even if they homeschool, they choose a mother's helper or they're putting them in front of some sort of screen or whatever. And are we considering the more subtle things? Like math is great, but what kind of attitude? I remember watching a math video that was very entertaining, that was completely rebellious in how it was presented. Your parents are dumb, and it was trying to give off this cool sort of ambiance or whatever. It was teaching math while undercutting virtue at every turn.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking about how you can hire a nurse who follows your directions. You can hire a babysitter who follows your directions, but actually has a terrible influence on your children.
I like that, as whoever is spending time, whoever words are in your children's ear is their curriculum and teacher.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm sure is true beyond the early years, but in the early years when they're less academic, that's the content in a way that isn't true necessarily in the older years.
Right. Because it makes up almost all their experience.
Right.
I liked where he says, do not, therefore, allow the boy to be accustomed, even in infancy, to a style of speech which he will subsequently have to unlearn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No baby talk.
No baby talk.
Yeah.
It is the worst impressions that are most durable. For while what is good readily deteriorates, you will never turn vice into virtue.
Yeah, I had that underlined too.
Well, and later on, he goes on to talk about how that's also their attitudes of speech, and about the older boy who has to be like carried around in a litter and waited on and basically treats the servants like they're dirt. That's part of it too. Someone needs to be able to call that little child on the onto the sorry, I'm totally messing up my metaphors today. Call the child on the carpet and tell them to knock it off and be respectful and be kind in speech and all those kinds of things. I think it goes beyond, it definitely is pronunciation, but some of what was said later made me think it goes beyond that to the spirit of addressing others and the content of what is said.
Yeah. I want to stay here on this section on Quintilian, but that's backed up in the Plato section where Plato talks about manners. The installation of manners in the young years is crucial.
Right. Yeah. To return a little bit to the nurse thing, I thought his argument that Philip of Macedon hired Aristotle to teach his son, even though his son was tiny, was very interesting. This is still on page 111, where he says, would Philip of Macedon have wished that his son Alexander should be taught the rudiments of letters by Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of that age? Or would the latter have undertaken the task if he had not thought that even the earliest instruction is best given by the most perfect teacher and has real reference to the whole of education?
Yeah.
Well, actually, it goes on a little bit more. Let us assume, therefore, that Alexander has been confided to our charge and that the infant placed in our lap deserves no less attention than he. Though, for that matter, every man's child deserves equal attention. That really got back to some of the other things we're learning in logic class where the virtue of the teacher matters. We can't get away from it. And I think we shudder at times because we're very aware of our own imperfections. And we secretly know we're not that great. But keeping that conviction in our hearts, it's good for our consciences to do that and to not push it down and push it away and think that it doesn't matter, because it does matter.
Yeah, it does matter. And if we don't keep that humble posture, we become the pedagogue or pedagogue, I don't know, pedagogy.
Yeah.
On 109, whose a frequent source of vanity is instilled, being imperious in instilling a thorough dose of their own folly because they have authority. And so they just instill themselves without realizing that they don't have real knowledge. And I think that's an important thing to remember with saying that the nurse or the mother should be a philosopher, is that we have a narrow definition of that today, and saying it means that you have to study and know philosophy as a subject. But as we've seen in Liberty of Logic,
Yes,
it's a mindset and an attitude of seeking wisdom and seeking the causes and being led by, it's being purpose driven.
Oh no.
Stop it.
Sure, you just violated someone's trademark right there.
But it means we don't get short-sighted or reductionist, ideologically driven, where one soapbox becomes everything. But we are broad and interested and always seeking wisdom along the way.
You know, with little kids, when you talk about reductionism, that can sound kind of nebulous, but I really think that can, when you're in those youngest years, that can manifest. I mean, what was he saying? Reductionism in the sense of reducing everything to something that's quantifiable or measurable. So when we get obsessed with milestones, and I mean, there's a place for considering milestones, and early intervention is good if a child is showing significant problems, but there can be an obsession with, you know, when you talk about like the infancy, an obsession with weight and with growth and with size. And then there's milestones. All of those things are things that are more quantifiable. In some sense, I think, are distracting us from the whole because they're keeping us in just the material, and they're not taking us to the immaterial. When we're focused just on those things, we're not being philosophical in the sense of considering the child's intellectual and spiritual life. We're just focusing on physical development. So we've taken, you know, what do we call it? The tripartite soul. And we've like emphasized just one part and said, this measurable part is the most important thing.
So it's important to be tracking those milestones, but it's not the only important thing. And just meeting those milestones isn't sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient.
Right. Well, and I've talked about before, I read a lot about gifted education. And one thing that I think is very notable is that when a child is doing really well on milestones and super, super advanced, there's a tendency to be very forgiving of character deficits, of vice. It's like this advanced area makes up for serious weaknesses in other places, and we're just going to ignore those and indulge the child. You know, it can go either way. If you have a child that's behind, you get obsessed with milestones for one reason. But if you have a child that's super advanced, you can get confident and ignore real problems because those real problems are in those other areas.
Yeah.
The things that can't be measured.
Or you don't find ways where they are challenged and they get frustrated and then they just give up, right?
Yeah.
Like things come so easily that it's finding ways for them to get that character and that virtue and things.
So Quintilian is saying, you know, more formal education starts at 7, but that doesn't mean do nothing.
Right.
So what does he envision should be done?
Well, I think this first section here that we're now moving past, but just establishing what he says in this first section with the nurse, is that what is done first is people care about his education. People speak to him intelligently, and the people around him, the way that the people around him are thinking and speaking and learning matters.
Yes.
So then he says on page 110, those, however, who hold that a child's mind should not be allowed to lie fallow for a moment are wiser.
So we're not beginning formal education, but we're also not letting them lie fallow.
Yeah. We also aren't just letting them have their own way and do whatever they want.
So he says, shortly after that, why, again, since children are capable of moral training, he means in those younger years, should they not be capable of literary education?
Yeah. There's a little bit of an anti-better late than early argument that follows that, where he says, I know that you would have more progress in a shorter amount of time if you waited, but that doesn't mean that you should wait.
Yeah, that was an interesting...
That sounds like an argument from a lazy teacher, not from someone who cares about the child.
Which is interesting, because I was kind of like, shoe tying's my example for this. Where
potty training is mine.
Oh, well, for me,
Sheesh.
I mean, I did this. Like, I didn't wait to potty train. Well, except for one, but that was because my husband's in the hospital and I kind of missed a window. But shoe tying, I just got so annoyed that I just waited until they were 6 and could teach them in a day. So I tied their shoes for them for like an eternity.
I'm not sure that my almost 8-year-old can tie. Like 8 or 9 is like when my kids learn how to tie
we
their
wear
shoe.
cowboy boots, so it's hard to...
You just buy
cheating.
shoes. You buy shoes that don't require to be tied.
And 4 of my kids are lefties, so
that's hard.
teaching left-handers how to do things is actually a little bit of a challenge. Actually,
I
our
bet.
5-year-old neighbor taught my boys how to tie their shoes. She has this really cool trick. So I was fine with that.
Well, there was when I had a few in that baby toddler stage, there was a local group, I don't know, a few people that were potty training their babies. And I was like, no, you're just training yourself. This is not
Right. Yeah.
I had late potty trainers, so I was
I don't
cool
know,
with that.
Misty. I did it with one of my kids, not fully, but he was potty trained fully by 18 months, and it was pretty fabulous. Like, he was pretty well trained by 12 months, and then at 18 months, we were no longer in any diapers whatsoever. So it was pretty great.
My sister-in-law did that, and when I said something like that to her, I remember her just saying, like, it doesn't matter because I use cloth diapers and I do way less laundry this way.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, good argument.
Yep.
I could see that.
That's what it was too. I was doing cloth diapers as well. Yeah.
Oh, it does coincide with cloth diapers. So
yeah.
I took the fill up the landfill approach.
Well,
yeah, me too.
I was going to cloth diaper my twins, and then they became what we call the super poopers, and 7 diapers each a day on poopies.
Yeah,
so
I know.
that was just, I was like, Matt, I can't do it. He goes,
Yep.
Buy all the diapers you want. I said, great.
I just didn't do it because California in a drought year, I'm not going to use a bunch of extra water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I love that before he gets into too many details, he talks about the child's personal experience of what's happening. On the top, near the top of page 111, he says, I am not, however, so blind to differences of age as to think that the very young should be forced on prematurely or given real work to do. That, before I even read the next sentence, reminds me of where Charlotte Mason talks about not teaching narration before the age of 6, but let them narrate.
Right.
And so like, she's like, she doesn't teach Latin until 4th grade. But if a 4-year-old wants to do Latin chants because they've picked it up somewhere, and let them do that. You're just not forcing them to do mental work that they don't want to do yet. So he goes on and he says, above all things, we must take care that the child who is not yet old enough to love his studies does not come to hate them and dread the bitterness which he has once tasted, even when the years of infancy are left behind. His studies must be made an amusement. And I loved that because it captured the spirit of what he's doing. So he may say all these details, but really the spirit seems to be one of play.
Yes. And I think it's important there when he says his studies must be made an amusement, is that the teacher isn't figuring out how to make all the subjects fun. It's that exposure. These things are around and the people around him are educated and talking to him and doing things, and he can do what he finds interesting and fun. So that reminded me of like the way we start math is at our house, at least I have had 4 and 5-year-olds who want to do a math page like the other kids, or who enjoy doing the math page. And so I give them one. Like if they want to and are asking for it, I would just say, yes, when you want to learn something, I will provide the resources for you to do that. But they never have to have a math page turned in. They never get in trouble like the 10-year-old for not doing their math that day.
Yeah, that was my theory on teaching reading because I had early readers. But if they didn't want to do phonics someday, I didn't do it. So every day, once they showed an interest and wanted to do it, I would offer it to them. And if it meant that we went backwards because we didn't do it for 2 weeks and they forgot something, it didn't matter. Because to me, it was more important. You know, a 4-year-old doesn't need to learn to read. And so I'm not going to force that issue the way that I would with a 6 or 7-year-old.
But if they're interested, then it's our responsibility to provide the availability.
Yeah. And my oldest, he wanted to read and probably he could read at age 4.5 or so, but he preferred me reading to him. And so I never pushed it. So I just kept reading to him. And by the time he was 8, he was taking off and reading chapter books on his own. And it was a very seamless and smooth thing.
Some of this also reminded me of people who on like Caitlin Beecham, people who on Instagram will post pictures of doing this tea time with their little preschool students, and they have out, you know, a piece of art and they read some poetry and they're doing all this, but it's like so much fun to the kids. It's not like they're forcing, look at this painting and narrate it or, you know, anything like that. They're just having this grand old time for about 45 minutes, you know, in the afternoon with treats and stuff. And I thought that's such a gentle way to start introducing children to great thoughts and everything, but in a way that they look forward to it.
Yes.
Well, and to notice that that is enjoyable and fun. And so the mother is doing it in a way where she's enjoying it as fun. And it's not the sort of thing where, oh, you're 3 or 4, Sesame Street is what you ought to be enjoying. You know, what are you presenting to them as enjoyable?
Right.
And we are shaping their taste and their interest in what we give them and what we assume about what's good for them and what they will like and what they will find fun. And we often underestimate preschoolers.
It's true.
And he goes on to say too, but studies like men have their infancy, and as the training of the body, which is destined to grow to the fullness of strength, begins while the child is in his cradle and at his mother's breast. And so it just goes on to talk about this too. It's like, it looks different for that preschooler than it will in the final, but it starts with good habits, right? It starts and it's appropriate. And sometimes, I don't know, a lot of the preschool stuff is just it's just too focused on, I guess, outcomes and hitting those benchmarks. And it's, so it can be very much not appropriate for their age.
I was thinking about this and about how he really is getting into this need to feed the mind, to keep the mind full.
Yes.
So I think by not letting the mind lie fallow, I mean, that's one way that we could view it. And I was thinking of this conversation I had with my girls today where they were going to be a mother's helper at a sick friend's house. And one of my daughters was like, well, you know, there's going to be 4 kids there. And she's like, what do we do if they get bored? We're going to be there for hours, you know? And it was funny because I was like, well, you know, bring some books to read to them because books from our house are probably ones they haven't seen. And remember, you can change locations. You can go into the backyard and then you can go into the house and then you can go into the front yard. And I was thinking about how if we just think of it as keeping them, not that it's bad for kids to be bored ever, but keeping them intellectually stimulated, making sure they have things that they can be interested in, whatever is appropriate for their age. I think some of it's as simple as that.
And he says small children are better adapted for taking in small things. So we aren't overextending. They might have attention, but we ought not to be forcing it beyond its current capacity.
Yeah. So what else? They could play with letters. You mentioned playing a little bit with math. What else is included in these?
He talked about shapes too, not just the shapes of letters, but just shapes in general, because that helps them be able to have more attention on the shapes of letters. But if you can't recognize that, you're going to be going over those things over and over and over again. So he said, talking about putting things in different orders so that it wasn't just words that they were memorizing, but the actual shapes of the letters so that they could do that. Right now in our program that is helping with dyslexia, one of the main things is to picture the word in your mind, spell it forwards, and then spell it backwards.
Whoa.
And so that is how we are doing spelling words. And it is changing our life.
Really?
But when they can picture it in their mind, it doesn't matter, if you reorder it, then they'll know that. So it's been really helpful.
We may need to talk about this later.
Okay. Sounds good.
He's teaching handwriting by tracing in wax so that the pen follows a groove. So you get the muscle memory of writing the shapes.
Yeah.
I mean, he kind of has some real specifics on
Practically
preschool
Montessori
instruction.
or something. Let's talk about the pronunciation and distinctness, because there is a school of thought that a child can be very discouraged if you're constantly correcting how they say things when they're little lisping people, you know what I mean? Then they're not quite capable of making all the different sounds. And he's talking about things like, let's see, like on 113, he says it'll be worthwhile by way of improving the child's pronunciation and distinctness of utterance to make him rattle off a selection of names and lines of studied difficulty. They should be formed of a number of syllables which go ill together and should be harsh and rugged in sound. I was thinking about, how people will use like tongue twisters.
Oh, yeah.
To try to help people learn to enunciate. But I'm wondering about the limits of this, because there are places where you could take away that the child can't say a single thing wrong without being corrected. I was wondering about the appropriateness of that, I guess.
Well, do you ever have kids that are guessers at words?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and they can almost make it work, but we're like, that's not the word. So, yeah, I think that there is attention to detail. I don't know. I think it's appropriate sometimes, and then sometimes it's.
I mean, we definitely did some. Well, I mean, one kid had speech therapy, like formal speech therapy, but we definitely had times where we were working on pronunciation. But I feel like we waited until they were the age where they should have it figured out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't just like correcting 2-year-olds and the pronunciation of things. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that it's important. What he's pointing out here is that the people around him should be speaking clearly and well. And so when the child says something, I don't repeat back his incorrect pronunciation where that becomes incorrect. It's acceptable. This is now the way the family says this word is the incorrect way. I might say it. He says it incorrectly. I say it back correctly to him. Maybe I have him re-say it. Maybe I don't. But I'm still not accepting. There are ways of reinforcing the right way without being critical.
My oldest struggled with the R sound for a long time. And I remember we invented different games where we would pretend to be a lion and we would roar. We would pretend to be a pirate and we would be R. But it was anything to get him to practice making that sound. So we weren't actually correcting it when he said it wrong, but we were making sure that he, just because of palate formation and stuff, like that he maintained the ability to even make the sound.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if that kind of thing also would kind of fall into this, where it's like a more playful thing, but it was actually very intentional. We wanted to make sure that he had the ability to say the sound.
Yeah, I know. Right now we have a 10-year-old who does not have the ability to say the sound, and he really needs to go to speech therapy. But
COVID, right? Yeah.
COVID. Yeah, we got him tested at 7 or just before. They said, give him some time, but he actually can't say the R's. We got the confirmation that he was physically just not doing it at all.
And that is how we had one child end up in speech, because all the other children could make the sounds that they weren't making in the words. And so we could just work with them. But this one, it was like, no matter what I did, he couldn't make the sound.
Mm-hmm.
He can now, but that's after 2.5 years of speech therapy. It's been hard fought.
Through the school district or medical?
Charter school.
Okay.
So yeah, but having their hearing checked is super important.
Yep.
Just for anybody who's listening, because my one that has this inability also had pretty significant hearing loss as an infant. It was not permanent, but it was why he missed some of his quote unquote milestones in speaking. It was because he couldn't hear out of one ear and could barely hear out of the other. So he couldn't duplicate the sounds.
Yep. That's important. I think Knox's, it's his tonsils and adenoids were enlarged and inflamed for
that's
while
right.
it was while he was learning the habits of making. So he makes those. He had a workaround to make these sounds that now he can't.
Yep.
Yeah. Now he's.
It's like my one that walked really super late, but our life was in complete chaos. It was like he missed a window and then had trouble figuring it out later.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of amazing how things like that happen.
Yep. Well, and I think that is a great time to point out the one spot that I really loved on this topic from Aristotle is on 57, where he says, moreover, individual treatment is better than a common system in education as in medicine.
Yes. I had that underlined too.
Me too.
It will appear then that private attention gives more accurate results in particular cases, for the particular subject is more likely to get the treatment that suits him. And he goes on, the physician or the teacher needs to know the general knowledge and the general principles and the universals, but individual attention gets better results.
Yep. Yeah, I loved that. Well, and that's so appropriate for these younger years, especially because they do get more individual attention. Well, I shouldn't say that because the more kids you have, the less likely that your preschooler gets any attention at all. But
But from the mother, they are getting attention for the particular child who knows them.
Yep.
So you don't need a specialist,
right?
Someone who has the universals and is trying to apply generals across the board, make the children fit the model rather than adapting to the child.
Okay, I did have one more thing with the Quintilian on page 112.
Okay, let's do it. And then I think that's going to have to be the last one just because of time.
But you will hardly believe how much reading is delayed by undue haste. If the child attempts more than his powers allow, the inevitable result is hesitation, interruption, and repetition. And the mistakes which he makes merely lead him to lose confidence in what he already knows. Reading must therefore first be sure, then connected, while it must be kept slow for a considerable time until practice brings speed unaccompanied by error.
Yes.
So good.
Yes. So that was the one that I...
Yeah. With my phonics curriculum, I've had people write in and ask, so how long should these lessons be? And I always write back and say, the reason why I don't prescribe a certain amount of time is because you just don't want to go past their attention. So if they can only pay attention for 5 minutes, then that's how long your reading lesson is. And the older a child gets, I think the more you can stretch them. But this idea that they're going to learn more when we go past the point where their eyes have glazed over, which I did to my poor oldest child many times, doesn't actually work. I loved that. And it kind of balances what he was saying earlier, because you feel like he wants you to get a jump start on reading, but then he's actually saying, don't be too hasty, don't overdo it. So I'm like, that's a really good way of keeping us in that moderate middle that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that giving them a literary education does not mean teaching them to read super early.
Yeah. Well, I think that gets back to some of the memory stuff, because I think part of the literary training was actually an oral tradition that was being passed down.
Yes.
So at the top of 111, when he says that since the the elements of literary training are solely a question of memory, which not only exists even in small children, but especially retentive at that age. I mean, I read that as it is never too early to start telling them the stories you want them to remember, or the poetry you want them to remember, or whatever. Those things are important. I mean, it reminded me of this whole idea of like, you don't just read them what they're capable of reading on their own.
Yes.
Yes.
Well,
yeah.
Is there anything else we should cover? I honestly feel like we could go back over all of this and talk about other things some other time, because there's so much more.
Okay. Well, the things that they brought up too is music and gymnastics. And I think that is such a good broad thing. Sing songs with your kids and play outside. I mean, those things, and gymnastics, moving their bodies. I think that's so important for those young years.
And we are going to have later this season a whole episode on physical education. So we'll have to try to remember to bring some of that into the conversation.
I think I'm the only one excited about that conversation.
No, I'm very excited about it.
Can I skip? I want to skip.
You cannot skip.
You and Pam are required.
Abby's going to make me feel bad.
I think Pam actually thought of it.
She did.
She might have questioned herself later.
She didn't know what she was getting into.
She had no idea what she unleashed.
That's true.
She opened the can of worms and hello,
she did.
Me, Abby.
This is where I get to work CrossFit into the conversation again. Just to make Abby sigh like that.
If you were really about CrossFit, you'd be talking about it all the time anyway. So,
That's true. That's true.
It's the joke.
I just like to joke about it. Okay. We should probably wrap up.
Okay.
Final words of wisdom.
Enjoy your preschoolers.
Yes.
Enjoy the time with you too.
Amen. All right. Well, thanks for coming, guys.
Thanks, Brandy. It was fun.
Thanks, Brandy. Bye, Misty.
Bye.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the upcoming episodes of our fall season. Every episode has a Scholé sheet, and this episode is no exception. At Scholé Sisters, we want to be people who apply what we learn rather than just listening and forgetting. Scholé sheets are individual journal pages to help you apply the ideas from the episode. Download your Scholé sheet for free from our show notes at scolesisters.com/ss76. Our annual fall online local retreats are something we look forward to every year, and this year is no exception. As I mentioned earlier, registration is now open over at scolesisters.com/love. Now, if you want to host a real-life local retreat event, just fill out the form at scolesisters.com/local and we'll help you pull it off. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone. So open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
I thought this was, you need to cut this. So.